Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chair.
Kia ora tātou no reira, honourable members. The House is in committee on the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Bill. Before the lunch break, the honourable member Dr Kennedy Graham had the call and has 4 minutes and 39 seconds remaining if he so wishes to seek the call.
Mr. Chair.
I call the honourable member Dr Kennedy Graham.
So do we. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just before lunch, sir, we were treated to a very impassioned speech by Leanne Dalziel, who arguably, along with maybe Brendan Burns, have electorates that have been most severely affected by the Canterbury earthquake. I want to pay tribute to both of them, and Ruth Dyson, the three electorates. In September, it was Waimakariri with Clayton Cosgrove, who I think did sterling work in assisting that community respond. And of course, the epicentre in September came from the Greendale earthquake, which I think, from memory, was it the Selwyn electorate, commonly known as Amy's fault. And in February, subsequently, it's the worst I can do. And in February, sir, we do not wish to waste the House's time, do we, Mr. Chair? In February, seriously, the three electorates that were most badly affected were Central, East and Port Hills. And I pay tribute to those three members who have worked so hard for the restoration of their electorates. And Leanne Dalziel herself, I know, has had considerable deprivation and difficulty in the execution of her work in her personal life, and I know that others have. I know that Ruth Dyson has, that the Minister himself has, that Brendan Burns has, and others. None of us in Christchurch are immune, or have been immune to this. Even in the so-called western suburbs, where I come from, Ireland, which I share with the Minister, we have had our difficulties. We were without power. We were engaging in glorious challenges of sanitation in the garden for a long time. And there is in fact restoration required there as well. I have no office still to this day downtown. It is cordoned in the drop zone. And I trundle cheerfully around Christchurch City in a camper van, otherwise known as the Greenmobile. And I in fact go into the eastern suburbs a great deal. I've visited New Brighton, Darlington, Bexley, Beckenham, Parklands and other suburbs, Aranui, where probably the deprivation is at its worst. So I know what it is to work with the citizens of Christchurch who are crying out for assistance. None of that, sir, justifies the extensive powers that we see in the bill here today. And earlier in the first reading, I advanced the Green Party's critique of both the issue of the inadequate community engagement, which we have addressed in our SOPs, which I advanced this morning in committee, and secondly, what we take to be the excessive powers in the bill, which we are also advancing in SOPs as well. And I invite you, sir, and the Minister and his government to
Order. Members bringing the chair into the debate. The use of the word.
Sir, very good. So I invite the Minister and his government to address the SOPs, which we have advanced in good faith, with a view simply to curtail what we take to be the excessive nature of the powers as opposed to the legitimate powers in the bill. Firstly, let me refer to SOP 235, which addresses Clause 15, which would add a new subclause 4 to the effect that, quote, once the recovery strategy is in place, the Minister and Chief Executive must ensure that they exercise their powers, rights and privileges in a manner that is consistent with the recovery strategy. Mr. Chair, there is a wide range of unilateral powers that are given to the Minister and the Chief Executive under this proposed Act. While we agree it cannot be and should not be business as usual after the catastrophic earthquake, there needs to be further checks and balances put upon those extensive powers. This amendment to Clause 15 would limit the Minister and the Chief Executive's emergency powers not only to a 9-month period, but also after that period they would need to be consistent with a recovery strategy. Secondly, SOP number 233 addresses Clause 70. And Mr. Chair.
I call the honourable member.
As it stands, sir, the government can change or override any law in the country until 2016 without any parliamentary oversight or independent checks, except for those few that are identified as exceptions. The amendments to Clause 70 would mean that the government can only change laws that are relevant to the recovery effort in Christchurch. We would achieve this by recommending that the words "without limitation" simply be omitted from subclause 3. This would require the government also to consult with other parties under Clause 70 take to be essential. And finally, SOP 234, which addresses Clause 71 and 72. In particular, I draw your attention to Clause 72, which we would insert an extra subclause 3A, quote, "If the Earthquake Canterbury Recovery Review Panel determines that a draft order in Council is contrary to the purpose of the Act as set out in Section 3, the draft order in Council must be set down as a motion by the Minister for approval by resolution of the House of Representatives." So we recommend these SOPs in good faith. Let me just quote, as I did this morning, from law expert Dean Knight about the excessive powers that are here in the Act, and particularly Clause 70, which I am addressing. Quote, "This bill continues the previous regime for the issue of orders in Council, amending primary legislation with some changes. The previous concerns about this regime are well known. Such wide Henry VIII clauses are contrary to the democratic imperative. Particular concern was expressed about the lack or weaknesses in checks and balances on the exercise of such powers. Regrettably, the new regime does not adequately respond to the concerns previously raised." And so that observation of Dean Knight is explicitly affirmed in the analytical paper that the Minister has produced. The analytical paper addresses each of the recommendations from the Legislative Advisory Committee, from the Law Society and from Dean Knight himself pertaining to Clause 70. And in response, the Minister is saying, with respect to the Legislative Advisory Committee, no change proposed, want powers to be consistent with the previous Act. That's the very point of criticism that Dean Knight and the Green Party are advancing. Also, a key focus of the legislation relates to timely decision-making. That is not sufficient, sir, not a sufficient reason not to proceed, timely decision-making. With respect to the Law Society, the Minister says no change proposed. These are exceptional circumstances. See Cabinet papers for policy rationale. Well, sir, we have. We have. And the argument in favour of Clause 70 is not sufficient and has been rejected by constitutional experts. And the same point with regard to Dean Knight. I won't reiterate it. Let me just conclude by just saying once again what I said this morning, to quote the Law Society, and I do this more in sorrow than anger, but it is with deep sorrow, because it is arguably the most fundamental issue that can come before this House, that is to say, the granting of excessive powers to the government, to the Cabinet, and to one person, the Minister. In general, says the Law Society, Henry VIII clauses, such as Clause 70, are contrary to the rule of law and good legislation principles. Let that be written into the record of this House, just as we're about to adopt these powers. Let it be written in to the record that it is contrary to the rule of law and good legislation principles, contrary to the democratic imperative, as Dean Knight puts it. Let us be clear and honest and transparent about what we're doing here. Those of us who are chatting to ourselves, those with our heads down, what have we got to say to the people of New Zealand when we're about to adopt these laws tonight? Contrary to the rule of law? The hell with it. The hell with it. We've got an extraordinary event. We've got an emergency here on our hands. We're going to rebuild Christchurch. So we'll just override the democratic imperative, simple as that. Where there is a need for legislative amendments or suspensions in order to facilitate the recovery program, a better alternative would be for Parliament to dedicate House time for those matters to be dealt with by legislation as they arise. That is what we proposed in the Green Party. We are talking to deaf ears. It is that clear. And I think the time will come, with great respect to the Minister and to his officials and to his government that is pushing this through, the time will come when we will regret that.